Hello, it's Craig Thompson, and this is the Stratford Slice. Today we talk about tariffs, trade, and Donald Trump. My guest today has great insight into the Canada-U.S. relationship. The Honourable Perrin Beatty is the former president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and before that, head of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association. He is also the former president of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and spent 21 years in Parliament, serving in a number of prominent cabinet positions, including Minister of External Affairs. Perrin Beatty joins me by Zoom. Perrin, welcome to the Stratford Slice.
Glad to be with you.
I don't know, a lot of Canadians are feeling a little bit shell-shocked right now. It's like waking up and discovering that your best friend is no longer your best friend and asking that question, do we really deserve this? How are you feeling about this Trump tariff trade war at the moment, personally?
Well, just exactly the same way as you describe. I was part of the government that brought in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and subsequently NAFTA. It was probably the most pro-U.S. administration in our history in Canada. And the whole of the relationship, the bilateral relationship for the last 30-something years, has been based on the premise that we were both in the same boat together, and that neither of us could drill a hole on the other guy's side of the hull without both of us sinking. That we believed that what was good for one of us was good for the other, and that neither of us would deliberately try to damage the other. That's gone.
And why? Like, do we have the goalposts keep changing here? So what's your sense of what the underlying motivation is? Is it drugs? Is it immigration? Or is it wanting to take over Canada?
The answer would be yes. What we have is goalposts that are constantly moving, and with different justifications or rationalizations being given every day. We had banks thrown in the other day as the reason, which is a surprise. When President Trump announced the suspension of the tariffs, he said he was going to use the next 30 days to see whether or not an economic arrangement could be worked out with Canada. Previously, he and his supporters were saying, well, this is all about fentanyl and illegal immigrants on the border. The challenge for us is that in any negotiation, you need to have an understanding of what the needs are of the people you're sitting across from. What's their bottom line? What do they have to achieve in order to declare a success? Our problem here is we simply don't know. And the rationale that's been given changes all of the time, with new items being thrown in and other ones being moved up the list or down the list. My sense at this point is that we are dealing with something that goes way beyond borders. That borders is an excuse. It's a way of satisfying the legal requirements for him to declare an emergency. But that in fact what we're looking at is a president who loves tariffs because he needs to raise hundreds of billions of dollars of new money to be able to pay for his tax cuts and for new spending that he promised as part of his commitments during the election campaign. That's number one. Number two is that he's trying to destabilize the economies of others so that investors looking to put money in will think twice. If somebody is looking at investing in an automotive plant in Stratford, they're going to ask themselves, well, if I build a new plant, is it going to be impossible for me to get across the border and to be able to sell to American companies? So it's causing investors right now, even when we have this 30-day timeout, it's causing investors to pull back. Three, what he's doing is he's looking to build the most favorable conditions possible for investment in the United States. So we should expect to find great regulatory changes in the U.S. and significant continued tax cuts for business in the U.S. to draw investors in. And then four, tariffs he sees as a useful tool to get others to bend to his will on issues that have nothing to do with commerce.
Even the Wall Street Journal this morning said that it was the dumbest thing that they've ever seen. And to attack two friends, Mexico and Canada, and yet let China off the hook, which they described as a true adversary economically. Do you, you're in the States right now, do you see a general mystified reaction? What is the response that you're observing in the media to what's going on between Canada, Mexico, and the United States?
Initially, there wasn't a high awareness at all that anything was going on. When Donald Trump was sworn in, there was more interest in whether or not TikTok would be allowed to continue than there was on the issue of tariffs with Canada or Mexico. Um, the same way as we came into this week, people were focused on other things. There are all sorts of other initiatives where he's breaking glass, such as on USAID or the Department of Education, or reaching into the FBI and the Justice Department and so on. And so people were focused on other issues. Suddenly, when the stock market uh, took a dramatic drop, suddenly when the news media started to report that the price of gasoline, the cost of doing home repairs, the cost of cars and so on were going to go up, it started to catch people's attention. But there simply wasn't the awareness before. I get the daily bulletin from USA Today, and I think 2 days ago we were the third item on the 2nd of February. We came after live updates on Puxatawny Phil.
Incredible. And Bob Ray was on Fox last night, ostensibly telling the truth about what was going on between Canada, and the reaction from people on social media, politicians, was quite negative. Did you see his interview or read about what he talked
I
about?
didn't. I read about it. I'm not sure that was the best forum to be going on to make the case. And I think the important thing is that this is going to be won or lost by Americans in the United States. And it's going to be business people, it's going to be editorialists, it's going to be Congress people, it's going to be senators, governors, mayors, and others saying this is bad for Americans. I don't think we're going to be terribly successful if we go to the Americans and we say, do this because we're nice people, or do this because you're being unfair, be fair to us. That doesn't cut a lot of ice. At the end of the day, people will be looking at what does that mean for me? And if it means that a president who was elected on the basis of holding down the cost of living results in the cost of the grocery store anytime you go there going up that much more, or every time that you fill your car up, that's 20 cents a gallon more than it was last time. Or if you're buying a car that it's $3,000 more, that captures people's attention. And they say, this wasn't why I voted for you.
Now, you've represented Canadians both in Parliament and in business when you were president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. On LinkedIn, you quoted Sir John A. Macdonald in a way to motivate Canadians to stand up for Canada. Do you have that Sir John A. quote in front of you, or do you have it off by heart?
I don't have it right in front of me, but he was saying when he moved the motion in support of union, that if we supported the union confederation, we would go on to great things. But if we allowed it to be broken, that we would be lost to history in essence. And that's essentially where we are today. It's important that there are echoes in history for us to look at. Canada came together because we had the scattered colonies of British North America that had reciprocity, that is, free trade with the United States. The Americans ended that. And there were a number of American politicians who believed that it was the quote unquote manifest destiny of the United States to absorb Canada. All of that sounds very familiar today. And the Canadians came together and said, we don't want that. We want to have our own country and to do something north of the 49th parallel that's unique here. And they came together to achieve that. The Confederation project is still unfinished. We have free trade agreements with other countries, including the United States, that make it easier to trade across national borders in many instances than across provincial and territorial borders in Canada. What what we need to do now is to go back. You'll remember that Sir John A. Macdonald, after Confederation was formed, and in response to these ties to drag Canada down into absorption by the United States, he announced the national policy. The national policy was focused on nation building. It was how do we complete the project of Canada. Tariffs were an important part of that. We aren't advocates of tariffs today in Canada, but that was in response to the Americans canceling free trade or reciprocity with the Canadian colonies. But also the building of the CPR to literally have bands of steel that would bind Canada together from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Um, and looking at what could be done to create a nation. For the first part of our history, we were we relied on the British colonial ties, and we kept on looking to the mother country as our guarantor of our independence. After that, we cut those ties, and for the last several decades, we've been relying on the relationship with the United States as a unique relationship, a special partnership that we have with them. And we've been seduced by how easy it's been to do business with them. It's the richest market in the world. 75 to 80% of what we export goes to them. We speak the same language. We have the same culture, similar system of laws. You can go on a plane today, fly down to Cincinnati, check into the Holiday Inn with your sample case, sign the contract, and be home for dinner. That's different from opening up Thailand as a market. So it's been very seductive. What's happening now as of January 20th and the swearing in of Donald Trump is that Canadians are being pushed out of the nest, or we're being told either get out of the nest or else we'll eat you by the new president. I believe that we should declare January 20th Canadian Independence Day. And what we need to do now is to say, how do we ensure that never again in the future do we allow ourselves to become so dependent on anyone that at the whims of a government, they can inflict this sort of damage on us? The criticism that I would have of us, particularly over the last decade, but even going back further than that, is that we missed the opportunity during good times to put in place the infrastructure that was necessary, the economic and physical infrastructure to make us resilient, to increase prosperity in Canada, and to ensure that we could always remain a sovereign and successful country. We don't have any choice now. And under very difficult circumstances, we need to move forward. There's no turning back. If anybody wistfully thinks that we can go back to the way it was before, that can't be, because we can never go back to the comfortable assumption that there would never be a government in Washington that would be deliberately trying to damage Canada.
So we must finish the nation building exercise that Sir John A. Macdonald started and rebuild our sovereignty now.
Yeah, step by step. It's painful. Things are, if we do get into a full-fledged tariff war, and what we have today is a timeout. It is not a resolution of any issue.
30 days. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we may be exactly where we were earlier this week, 30 days from now. But in any case, there's every reason to believe that Mr. Trump, as other issues come up, will simply go back to this and say, either you bend to my will, or else I'll impose 25% or 30% or 50% tariffs on you. And he's not constrained either by the principles of morality or of law. What he is doing, CUSMA, our Continental Free Trade Agreement, was negotiated by him. It replaced NAFTA. He said that NAFTA was the worst trade agreement ever in history. And he said CUSMA was the best trade agreement ever in history. What he is threatening to impose unilateral tariffs on Mexico and on Canada is illegal, not only under the World Trade Organization legislation, but also under CUSMA. And he's unconcerned by that. What he's doing is trying to find a subterfuge by claiming there's a national emergency on the border to be able to claim national emergency powers to impose tariffs. But he gives one reason for doing it, which is fentanyl and illegal immigration, which in the case of Canada, fentanyl, we contribute about 1% of the fentanyl that's stopped at the borders of the U.S. In the case of illegal immigration, about 1% again. So, it's hardly demonstrable that Canada, being on the northern boundary of the United States, is a threat to the security of the United States. But he uses that excuse to give him a legal basis for imposing the tariffs, but then rolls into that all sorts of economic issues. Are we going to be open to American banks, more open than we are today? What about defense spending? What about the trade imbalance between Canada and the United States? And this is a convenient lever for him to use, these tariffs, at any time. So what's this mean to us? It means that even if we're able to avert the immediate crisis that we're facing, we have no reason to believe that over the next 4 years that these won't be brought out of the desk drawer again to be used against us. That means then that we need to look at how do we take our own future into our own hands and ensure our sovereignty as a nation.
Here in southwestern Ontario, as you know, we're heavily reliant on the automotive sector, and parts and cars go back and forth across the border at least 8 times before a car is sold. What surprises me the most is we're not hearing from the large car makers in the United States who would have to spend billions rebuilding, retooling, moving their operations into the United States. It seems almost like an impossible economic task to do that. How are we going to get through on the auto side of things?
They are weighing in. And it was interesting to see after our trading, after the timeout was announced, that the shares of both Ford and GM jumped substantially, because there was the recognition that this would have been devastating for them. Within a week of these tariffs being imposed, we would have seen assembly lines on both sides of the border shutting down and thousands of people being put out of work. We saw the stock market take a significant dive right when it opened. And as a result, it caught Donald Trump's attention, as it should. And we've been seeing increasingly people representing specific sectors of the economy weighing in. What has been disappointing, I'll choose my words carefully, what has been disappointing has been that the national organizations have been quite tepid. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers has probably been the most active of the three, and then the Business Roundtable. If you go into their websites, this doesn't feature prominently, and it should. And but I believe that what we're dealing with is a situation where many businesses are afraid to stand up to Donald Trump, just as members of the Republican caucus in the Senate and the House of Representatives are afraid, and just as the courts have been cowed as well, because the message that he gives is, you stand against me, I'll destroy you.
You and I have been on a number of trade missions to Asia, where Canada now has an Indo-Pacific strategy to build up trade. Is that going to help Canada expand its markets? Are those things that we have to really look at? And there's also talk about an EU partnership with Canada. How can we fill the gap that could potentially be left by the United States?
We need to be realistic about it. Despite all of the efforts that we've made to diversify trade, some 75 to 80% of our trade still goes to the United States, of our exports. And the challenge is it's a very seductive market. It's one which is the richest market in the world, and it's one that we haven't tapped out yet. And And also, it often takes a good deal of time to put in place the infrastructure that would allow you to retool and to be able to get your products to market. I am very critical of our government for impeding the construction of pipelines to Tidewater over the course of the last decade. If we had built, for example, Energy East to take Canadian energy to the Canadian East Coast, we wouldn't be reliant on Donald Trump's goodwill for Eastern Canada to supply ourselves, and we would have been in a position to be able to ship our resources to markets around the world. But it takes many years, decade or more, through the process that we have today, the regulatory process and the political process, and the need to physically build to put this infrastructure in place. So the challenge for us is that with all of the will in the world, it's not a matter of being able to turn on a dime that you say, I'm going to simply redirect the business that's being refused by Donald Trump and put it somewhere else. It's a longer process and a much more difficult one, but it's one on which we need to focus. We simply have too many eggs in one basket today. I've always said when people ask me, well, should we be growing our trade with the United States, or should we be doing more with the rest of the world? My answer was always yes. I never saw it as binary. Why would doing one prevent you from doing the other? But the problem is that we've been so focused on the United States that we have not given the attention to developing trading relationships with the rest of the world.
Now, you retired in August as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm sure when you retired, you didn't expect this tariff wave to happen. How have you been called back into action? What role are you playing now, now that you've exited that organization?
One of the things that I co-founded with Professor Van Hampson of Carleton University, is the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations. We created that when I was still at the Chamber, and then I took it with me when I left the Chamber. And so we've been very active with a group of about 14 or 15 experts, so former diplomats, people in the military, trade negotiators, trade experts, business people, former elected officials, and others, to look at what are the threats to Canada, what are the opportunities, how should we be moving ahead in this relationship. I just finished a 2-hour meeting with them just before we started taping this podcast. All of us are, everybody has different ideas in terms of exactly what we should be doing, but where there is a very strong consensus is that we need to look beyond this to what is the role that Canada wants to play in the world? How do we become a truly mature and independent country? How do we ensure that we can build our resilience and create brighter futures for young Canadians? How do we ensure that we rebuild the respect in the rest of the world for Canada? And that we need to look beyond the immediate crisis of the day to what do we want to be? Where do we want to go? How can we decide our own fate? How do we get there from here?
In the immediate future, whether it's 30 days, 90 days, or beyond, what advice have you got for the businesses that you once represented as head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, small, medium, large-sized enterprises? What can they do? Because there's obviously a lot of uncertainty. What advice would you be sharing with them right now?
Well, first of all, they certainly have to acquaint themselves of how if tariffs go ahead, how the new tariff regime would apply to them. And our government has published material in terms of how it would intend to respond to the American tariffs. We need to get a better understanding of what Donald Trump proposes to do with us. There are a number of sources out there. For example, Gowlings, the law firm, I saw a bulletin that they put out recently, just really with a checklist of information that businesses need to know. And that's very useful. Other firms will be doing the same thing as well. So it's first of all educating yourself. Secondly, looking at If prices are going to go up for supplies that I need, what alternative suppliers do I have? Are there Canadians available? Or if not, are there other affordable suppliers from other parts of the world that I can turn to that would allow me to redirect my orders for supplies? We need to look at what can we do if there is a um, set of tariffs put on our exports in the United States. Are there other markets, either domestically or internationally, that we can sell to? One of the things I suggested today in a tweet that was the chambers of commerce should be partnering with government to develop labeling and tags that can be distributed to retailers and that can be used by Canadian producers. What we're finding is a wave of patriotism among Canadians saying, I want to buy Canadian, but my problem is I don't know what is Canadian and what isn't, what's actually produced here. It would be very helpful if when you went into a store, there was a tag there that says, this is a Canadian product. And so there are a lot of things that we can be doing working together to mitigate this. There are things that government can certainly be doing immediately. The provincial governments could this afternoon start to dismantle interprovincial barriers to trade. Our governments could be starting immediately to roll back layers of regulation that cause a regulatory sclerosis, where you get decision by delay, that people simply walk away from projects because they can't get an answer. So there are a lot of things that we can and should be doing, and we should be taking advantage of this 30 days to get moving.
Well, even my 10-year-old daughter going to the grocery store with me has a list from social media on what we can buy from Canada. So I think what you said, there is this wave of attention and patriotism that is pulling the country together. And on the business front, I also want to thank you for what you're doing, because you're standing up for Canada as well. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts on where we're at with the
Thank you.
Canada-U.S. relationship.
Very glad to do it.
Thank you, Perrin.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, isn't it?
It sure is. But there are plus sides, little
Well, silver
glints
lining.
of
Yeah,
yeah, but what you were just mentioning, I've never seen Canadians as patriotic
yeah,
as they are right now. Usually you get the national anthem played and we look at our feet and shuffle our feet and mumble the national anthem. Um, we consider it unseemly to
yeah.
say we're proud of the country. Well, Canadians are rediscovering that this has some value, and it will force us, if we're being pushed out of the nest,
Yeah.
will force us to ask ourselves what we want to be when we grow up, and that's a
Yeah.
good thing.
I just came back from Ottawa. I was in Ottawa last week for our annual Media Producers Association, where the new president of the CBC was interviewed, and we're all talking about how to protect Canadian culture jobs and tell Canadian stories. And there seems to be a spirit of collaboration in Canada. We've got to get more on our own feet, in terms of pulling together to tell Canadian stories, because our sector is really hurting right now. There's nothing, of course, CBC is under threat, and
Yeah.
no one really knows what's going to happen next. So, and the Bill C-11 is being challenged in federal court by all the streamers who don't want to pay into the Canadian system, which is also an irritant for the U.S. government, right? So,
Yeah, but if Trump goes ahead, then the rules of the game are changed
yeah,
substantially. I was, for example, the digital services tax, death on the idea, because we were simply setting ourselves up as a target for the Americans. The Americans were very direct with me when we took a mission to Washington last March or April, where they said, "We are planning countermeasures now. You do this, and you are going to poison
yeah,
any negotiations that we have." I thought it was a terrible mistake. But if Trump is declaring war on us, then the issue is, how do we respond?
yeah,
I'm not sure that tariffs are always the best way to respond, but I did take a look at the inauguration, and there was $1 trillion worth of oligarchs
yeah,
standing behind Trump, who paid You know, a trillion didn't pay $1 trillion. They're worth $1
millions
trillion.
for a seat. Yeah.
Yeah, millions of dollars and lots of their dignity.
Yeah.
And okay, so they got his ear. Well, let's use their access to his ear by making it clear that there's a price to be paid here.
Yeah.
So to me, it isn't all a matter of tariffs. There may be other measures that we
Yeah.
can take that have an impact that don't have the same inflationary impact within
Yeah.
Canada.
Well, thanks again for your time, Perrin. I will
Pleasure.
have a good trip to Australia.
Will do.
Okay.
All the best.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye bye.